John Niehaus, Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. I'd like to welcome you to this edition of the NAFI Briefing Room, where I welcome three of our panel instructors to talk about international operations and how that applies to flight instruction. Today, my guests are Randall Williams. He's a CFII and an MEI, and he just finished his ATP CTP course. Congratulations and welcome. I have Adam Webster. He's also a CFII and an MEI. He's an entrepreneur and an aviation mentor. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And I also have Sarah Rovner. She's returning to a NAFI video here, and she's a II, MEI, ATP, master instructor, and also owner of Full Throttle Aviation. Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so appreciative that you guys were able to make it. And actually, this is a topic suggested by Randall himself. So Randall, thank you.
Happy to do it. Happy to talk to you. And it's fun to be able to get a bunch of friends together to have this conversation.
Absolutely. And we'll learn a little bit about the three of you as we sort of continue through this discussion. But first talking point is, how does international operations apply to flight instruction? What are the benefits? Randall, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think there are a couple different ways to think about flight instruction. Those of us who are at airports, when people call and say, hey, I'd love to learn to fly, that's certainly one model of flight instruction. And another model of flight instruction is supporting owners who are already flying as they move up into different airplanes. Sarah and Adam have done a lot of that. I've done some of that. I've done some of that while working for Sarah at Full Throttle. But an owner who moves up into a TBM and needs an experienced II sitting beside them so that they don't get caught in instrument clearances or procedures, that's also flight instruction. And so if we think about international flying, we all got into flying because we were excited about getting off the ground and getting up into the air. And the difference between somebody saying, hey, I'd love to learn to fly, and that the way that they light up when they leave the ground for the first time, those are very different feelings. And so as we can capture somebody's excitement about, well, you mean I can fly to the Bahamas? You mean I could fly down to Cancun for the weekend? You open up a different segment of student, of airman, and a different possibility for them in their own training, in their growth as a pilot. And you really open up a world of possibilities when you can take people different places.
Adam, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, just to expound on what Randall said, and to give a sense of geography and how quickly it all changes. If right near Randall in Brunswick, Maine, is the Bar Harbor Airport, and my first experience, really working both sides of the border. For example, a client that just bought a 210 that was based in Maine, less than 30 minutes away is Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, over a bunch of open water, but it goes by very quickly. And those of us that grew up in the Northeast or with a foot in both countries, i.e., Canada and the U.S., the freedom. Well, actually, COVID's a good example. People that had access to Cessna 210s could actually have some element of continuity in their lives because they could go and get to places like Prince Edward Island or New Brunswick or Quebec City, for that matter, while the border was largely shut down to everybody else. So the interface of instruction and the imagination, like Randall said, where someone says, oh my God, I can go to the Bahamas. The really cool thing about it is that GA is also very different all over the world. So when you do experience GA, for example, in Canada, Europe, or sub-Saharan Africa, you actually begin to appreciate the US a lot because it's pretty loosey-goosey and pretty fast here and pretty informal. And it's not the case when you're filling out ICAO flight plans and hopping across borders. So there's also the learning element has this kind of appreciative element where you appreciate the fact that being in the birthplace of aviation and then kind of bringing our footprint outside of it, you really appreciate how we formed, a lot of those aviation laws in other places, but also the flexibility of getting in and out of them.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sarah, the last time we spoke, I was sort of in awe with how many different countries you had been to. How does instruction apply to going to all of these different places?
That's a really good question. To be honest, a lot of the international flight instruction I've given has been while crossing the ocean, whether it's one of our ferry pilots or a lot of times the owners themselves who have bought an airplane and they live over in Europe are hiring me to go along as a flight instructor and train them on the way over there. So I've given a lot of instruction to people who want to perhaps continue to fly across the ocean, which would be like, for example, our ferry pilots or even some of our owners who have these plans to do these worldwide flights and they wanted to get used to the operation. So since I'm only have a US flight instructor certificate, even though I do have certificates in Canada and Europe as well as Belize, I can only provide flight instruction in US registered airplanes. So a lot of the flight instruction I've given, I've kind of prepared people for continuing to fly internationally, whether that be Europe or Central America or South America or wherever the place may be.
So folks, I'm going to open this next question up and we'll just kind of let the conversation flow here. So if I'm an instructor and I'm trying to kind of figure out my instructor toolkit and I want to add something like international instruction into my sort of general lesson plans, where do I start and how do I even get into something like this?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I mean, if I had $1 for every time I tried to get into international ferry flying and got told I couldn't do it by an insurance company or by just knowing I couldn't figure everything out on my own, I'd be rich. So, you know, the first thing for me is, of course, there's a lot of resources available on the internet, but unfortunately, the internet, everybody has a different opinion and you don't get the tribal knowledge that you need from doing it yourself. So my best recommendation is that if you're an instructor and you want to start getting into international operations is to go with somebody who's done it before. Even something as simple as the Bahamas. I mean, you can probably get away with maybe the Bahamas and Mexico. There's a great organization called the Baja Bush Pilots that helps owners who want to fly internationally and kind of gives them a checklist and a way to do it. But if you're going to be doing anything that's incredibly exotic, especially when you have to arrange for private avgas or get a mountain worth of permits, my best recommendation is to find somebody who's done it before, such as myself or Randall or Adam, and use us as a resource to go along with you on your first few journeys.
We see a lot of people on the international ferry pilot forums who are excited about getting into things and, ooh, this looks like a long cross country. I'll just do that. Little different than that. Good example is I had my first flight in England. I was with Sarah, and I had spent weeks and weeks preparing. Sarah had sent me lots of reference material that I'd been studying, both about the plane and the mission and the airspace, and we blasted off. And as soon as we blasted off, the controller said, "Stay clear of controlled airspace." And I went, because I didn't know where that was. And I'd been studying the flight for weeks. And Sarah's like, "Yep, descend and turn right here." And she had it. She had her head already wrapped around it. So there's lots of little things like that. I think you said the toolkit thing that you said is really informative and interesting. It seems like as we do things that we're excited about and we do missions that feel good to us and stuff that we're interested in, I think we are growing our tools. And so I think as flight instructors, it's important that we keep growing that toolbox so that we're ready when things come up. Good example of that is I have somebody who wants to do a lot of Cessna 182 flying. Well, okay, but what it means is that I'm going to be able to fly a Cessna 182 when someone comes to me and says, "Do you have 50 hours in type?" I can say, "Sure, I've done that." Or somebody says, "Hey, have you done customs procedures before?" "Yep, done those a dozen times. Here's what those look like." And so as we do the things that we're most interested in, we are growing that set of skills. And as we say yes to more opportunities come up.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of to just listening to both of you talk about it is all the colossal mistakes I've made with not paying attention to the evolution of EAPIS and exit clearances and whatnot. And by the way, I've been lulled into complacency many times because Canada and Quebec was such a big part of my life living in the Northeast that a great instructional piece is actually, as Sarah and Randall can attest to, is just because things were one way 5 years ago doesn't mean they're going to be the same way. And my story there is I used to operate 135 between Maine and Quebec a lot, and then I took about 5 years off, and I came back on a Part 91 flight, and didn't believe I had to tell the Americans I was returning to Ontario, because back in the day you didn't. Anyway, I quickly got behind multiple $10,000 fines.
Ooh.
And I had to use my salesmanship and charming, assuaging, persuasive tongue to convince Officer LeBlanc to let me off the hook, because I just was operating literally 5 years behind the times. So yeah, the EAPIS stuff and the letting countries know you're leaving is just as important as letting countries know you're arriving, and that's something I learned the hard way with Quebec and Maine. But the reality is, it's the cool part about teaching, and Sarah might be able to test this, teaching in an N-numbered airplane anywhere in the world. You're kind of in a little FAA bubble, so you're doing your instruction in Cape Town or Namibia or what have you. But the minute you start going across boundaries, you want to have that tribal knowledge, to the point where I had the cell phones and personal cell phones of customs officers that I got through a network of people in South Africa, because I knew that it would just make life that much easier to be pretty intimate with the town you're going to, who you can expect to deal with on arrival, and being incredibly gracious of everything. In other words, don't expect things to fall into place with amazing customer service and other neoliberal assumptions you might carry. The fact is that even in the Bahamas, I'm sure we come across this in a small way, but when you get into the African continent or even Central and South America, you're really learning human skills. The instruction side of you is really becoming on how to become personable and relate to them, because I don't know, I just would say that's a big part of the lesson, is just being able to really be a good human and figure out how to accomplish your goals without foisting your timetable on them.
Now, Adam, you've
Yeah,
mentioned EAPIS a couple times. Now, for those that don't know or understand what that is, could you define that for me?
Yeah, so essentially, EAPIS is a system where the the basic USCIS and FAA work together to track you as you enter or leave the U.S. And EAPIS is essentially like IACRA. You log in and you set up an account, and you pre-populate it with your airframe information and your pilot information. It's actually been quite some time since I've done an EAPIS filing. I think it's been about 5 years since my last one. So Randall and Sarah are likely much more current than I am. But all I can say is that if you operate under Part 91 and you cross the border, you're a de facto air carrier in the eyes of USCIS. They don't really distinguish anymore between 121, 135, and 91. So you're basically being held to an airline level database disclosures on movements. Is that accurate, Sarah and Randall?
My last EAPIS was 48 hours ago, and I think there are a couple little pieces to think about. Yeah, you need to go online and fill out EAPIS for an arrival in the United States. You need to get your sticker from DTOPS as well, which requires an account. If you end up doing that last minute, you can always just show them your registration number and say, hey, I signed up even though I didn't get the sticker yet. But don't forget to call. There's a requirement that you call.
Yeah.
And I remember arriving in Portland, Maine with a student, actually, coming back from Canada on an international flight with a flight student. And we arrived into Portland, Maine, and there was no customs there to greet us. And I called the tower, and tower called customs because it would have been helpful to have the customs officer's cell phone, but I didn't, and there was no one at the office. And the tower calls back on the landline and says, he's on his way. He says not to leave the airplane. And I'm thinking, okay. And an hour later, he shows up and he said, who's responsible for this? And I went, oh, here we go. And sure enough, he looks at me and he says, you didn't call. I said, well, sir, I did call and I got no answer. Well, you should have left a message. Didn't know to leave a message, but I'd like to show you, here's my telephone record of me calling Portland multiple times 4 hours ago. Here's my call to Bangor. Here's the officer I spoke with in Bangor. I'm sorry I wasn't able to reach you. He said, well, I'm glad you just showed me the record of you making the call, because otherwise you would have gone on the list. And if you go on the list, you are always going to have problems getting into and leaving the country ever again. And that's the kind of thing that you'll just fall right into and think, oh, I'll just fly over there. And like Sarah says, if you get in it without going with somebody who does it before, the number of things that you could miss is so high that you can really fall in a hole. I'll give you another really quick example. Was in the Bahamas 5 years ago, and my 172 had filed an IFR flight plan, was holding short. They said, you're going to hold there for about 20 minutes waiting for release. And I said, well, I'll just go VFR. They said, great, clear for takeoff. So I took off. And so I'm flying along, and I get on with Palm Beach Approach, and she says, yeah, I don't have you in my system. I said, no, I've got my squawk code. She says, sir, I don't have your flight plan. Because, of course, I had filed an IFR flight plan. I had an IFR squawk. And at this point, since I'm VFR, I'm 2,000 feet under the clouds. The cloud top's about 10,000 feet. I'm 2,000 feet under the clouds. I'm 5 minutes from the ADIS boundary, moving at about 100 knots in my little 172. And she says, can't help you, try flight service. So I pull up flight service, and there are 5 other people in frequency, and he says, stop. Everybody just stop. Now, whoever that was calling just east of Lauderdale, go. And I said, 72 Golf, need a flight, need a squawk code. So he got right back to me. I ended up cutting in line. He said, you're already on a VFR flight plan. Here's your squawk. Punched it in, called approach. And she said, great, I've got you, no big deal. But that was a hard lesson that I was learning while I was at 2,000 feet under the clouds out over the water minutes from the ADIS. And that kind of stuff can really get you in trouble.
So for those that are looking to actually sort of integrate this into their flight, not flight plans, but their lesson plans with students and sort of sell this as a service that they provide, would you structure a plan more as a sort of mission-based flight instruction plan, or like what would you do there?
Well, the first thing is I would reinforce the importance of understanding where you're going and their local regulations. I mean, under ICAO, there is a level of standardization, but unfortunately, the level of standardization is not really enough for you to be able to just jump in there and go. So my best recommendation would be location specific. If a student wants to specifically fly to the Bahamas, that's a very different procedure than, let's say, flying to Haiti, because Haiti has very special entrance clearance requirements and everything like that. So I would definitely make it more mission specific and emphasize the importance of, hey, just because this is the rule here doesn't mean it's the rule there.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. Now, for somebody who's in, let's say, Kansas City, they're in the middle of the country, they're nowhere near any borders or any of that kind of stuff. Is there a way that an instructor who's looking to sort of work with a student who has these kinds of interests, can you simulate this in any way?
I mean, I suppose you could. For me, it's always best if I'm going to try to learn Chinese to go to China. And so I like to make it really applicable to students. And so you could certainly have the conversation with somebody in Kansas City. I would want to really have a look at what that student is interested in and what it is they want to do. And if they're dreaming of going to Mexico, then absolutely, let's have that conversation. But I would much rather schedule a flight to Mexico and take them and get them lit up around the possibility of, having that conversation in Cancun or Puerto Vallarta or something. So that we actually do it and really bring it home to them. So I think as you're thinking through what you can offer and you say, hey, I offer international flight work, the world anymore and social media, people get inspired by what they see you doing rather than what they see you listing that you can do. And I think just being out there and having that kind of life and doing those flights and reaching out to students who are excited about those flights. And when I say students, think back to the person who's just bought themselves, a Baron 58 or something. Like, it doesn't have to be a primary student who's thinking, gosh, it'd be great to go abroad someday. It can be the person who just decided that they need to buy a Challenger for themselves and they now want to make Europe trips and need to look at, refueling and ETOPS and all that good stuff. So student is really broad on this spectrum.
And I just looked, while Randall was speaking, I was running a 4-flight line between KMCI, and I started off with Winnipeg, but believe it or not, I dragged it down to the very southern chunk of Ontario that dips into basically, around Erie, Pennsylvania, and that's only 600 miles. So in a 182, that'd be a 4.5-hour leg. Given that there's a cross-country IFR component for the instrument rating, long cross-country, or there's time looking to be built, even in Kansas, you can find a Canadian context to play with to kind of do it in real time. The simulation question, that's a good answer. There's so many things to go wrong. Like Sarah was saying, there's so many things to track. You really want to kind of be in the thick of it to kind of have it all happen. And I would say that the 603 nautical from MCI to Chatham, Ontario would be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
One other tiny little piece here, and then I'll shut up. I had a student who was building time in a Duchess, and we were in Maine, and I said, well, let's go to Florida and then the Bahamas, and then let's go across to LA and come back. He's like, can I bring my wife? I said, absolutely. And so it suddenly turned into a trip, and now there was an international component, and they put me up in a 5-star in the Bahamas, and that was all right too.
And especially now, there's a lot of COVID restrictions. I mean, that's another thing to take into consideration. And as we go forward, things might be changing with that. I mean, it changes by the week. I mean, you look at the NOTAMs and they issue a new one every week as to what the restrictions are. As far as simulating it, you could always call up Randall and have him speak a bunch of French real quick to you on the frequency, and then try to decode what the other pilots are saying up in Quebec.
As a student pilot, I flew in Brazil and I was completely lost.
I'll tell you, as a Quebecer, I'm born in Montreal, but I got all my ratings in the U.S. So even though I'm Canadian, I did all my FAA tickets first before I got my Transport Canada tickets. And having flown, in many places all over the world, I will tell you the only place in the world where they don't speak English on the radio when you're away from the big airports is Quebec. It's unbelievable. 126.7 is their en route frequency, and there are people just speaking French. And so now that's rare. If you hear a Japanese airliner talking to a Russian controller, it's going to be in English. But there are places in the world, I'm sure, besides Quebec, but it is mind-boggling that you can get out there and be around some non-English speakers on the radio.
So we've talked about some things that are challenging for those that are getting into it. One of the things we also want to highlight are a lot of the positives, and I think some of that is inherent in the conversation. But when we're talking about the idea that doing some international experience for students benefits them, whether they want to travel to a new place that they've never been, or whether they want to purchase that airplane that's capable of something that they might not have originally been trained in. Let's talk about the instructors. You guys all do things outside of your sort of instructional background. How much of the international experience that you gained prior to doing some of those things, or even sort of in the beginning, do you think would translate into kind of a boost in the instructor's profile or resume, if you will, for whatever it is that they might have planned next?
I was going to say that right off the bat, the type of work that Sarah and Randall and I do on the mentoring side, basically, the more international experience you have and the faster you can get it, the more you're of value in being essentially a highly capable, educated companion that can help them safely navigate new scenarios, which are, as Sarah mentioned, are fraught with so many places to fall down. So I think if you think about the flight instructor as not a safety pilot, but an instructor that is also a mentor, really, somebody who is just there to make sure that they are learning without any major violations inadvertently being committed, which are stunningly easy to do. That's the main value, is having that feather in your cap of the international operations makes you infinitely more useful as essentially you're a contract pilot that's attached to the student.
Yeah, and it's really hard. This is one of those catch-22s, and I know we run into this a lot in aviation where you need experience to get experience.
Right.
And, it really is. But, there's a lot of people out there who do have the experience. And I know that, people are eager to just kind of start this on their own. And you probably can, with very light international stuff like bigger airports and maybe Canada and Mexico. But, if you're going to get beyond that level, you're really going to need to work with somebody who's done it before. Another good resource too is that I know it's extremely expensive and probably more per leg than the cost of hiring one of us per day. Last time I got a quote, and I do all the stuff myself. So, you could always use a handling company, and they can also kind of walk you through all the stuff you need. You can submit all your documents to them in advance. But once again, they're incredibly expensive. I think just to fly across to Canada, it's over $700 for them to do all the paperwork for you. But once you've done it a few times, you can use them as a resource. You can probably start doing it on your own after that point.
Having a second language is really helpful. So Spanish is, I think, immensely valuable for the planet. Randall and I are both cursed in that we just have French, although Randall's Russian is not terrible. But language is really important. Yeah, so I think in terms of comfort with borders, to the extent you can make an effort to at least show that you're trying, you can win the hearts and minds of any armed people you might be dealing with to finalize movements.
If you think about the whole toolbox thing and the idea that we gravitate towards what excites us, we pull the thread on something we're interested in, doesn't it make sense to build a career based on something that really excites you? And so if bush and tailwheel flying and skis are your thing, like it is for Adam and Sarah, then why not pull on those strings? Why not put a bunch of money into a gorgeous Super Cub? Why not become an expert on a 180 like Adam is, with thousands of hours of skis and float time on 180s? And so when people call you looking for work, it's one thing to think of it as a resume booster. It's another thing to think, I've built a life that really lines up with what this person needs. Adam called recently and said, hey, there's a gig we might be able to use, and they're looking for flight support, and they're going to be making regular trips to Quebec, so they need French-speaking pilots. And we both said, yep, let's do that. I had somebody ask for flight support the other day who said, starting in the spring, we're going to be making regular trips into Canada. I'm like, well, done that a bunch, happy to do it. So keep growing the skills that you're excited about, and those opportunities will keep coming up. And the more that you can work in a straight line doing a straight thing, congratulations. I have a really hard time doing it. Adam has a hard time doing it because we're both serial entrepreneurs who want to do 8 things at once. He's like, fly a Phenom? Sure, let's do that. Fly a 180? Absolutely, let's do that, And so do the stuff you love, and once you're good at it, and you'll be able to create a career from it, because we always have a need for competent pilots and instructors. There will always be a need for training, for support, for flying airplanes, helping other people fly airplanes. And why not grow the skills that you're excited about growing so you can keep being asked to do those kinds of gigs? That's.
Yeah, if I can add to that, John, to piggyback on what Randall's saying, and Sarah can attest to this as well, I'm sure, which is that post-COVID, we're going to have very, very soon, I believe, we'll be back to the pilot shortage place. But when we return to the pilot shortage, I believe the critical shortage is actually going to be CFIs, specifically functional, dedicated teachers that really like mentoring and that kind of stuff. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is, per what Randall's saying about following what makes you passionate. Let's say amphibious float flying in a caravan is what you want to do. You don't have to be afraid to pursue that somewhat recklessly, because you're going to be wanted whatever it is you do, as long as you keep adding ratings, as long as you keep building your CV. If you want to take a left turn and go make very little money, in Bimini or whatever, Botswana, it's not going to hurt you, because the number of qualified people that are required to move flying machines around is shrinking quite rapidly relative to the demand that's coming. It seems counterintuitive during COVID, but there's a really good guy called Addison Sconland who runs a thing called Aviation Insight, and he wrote a very good an analytical piece explaining how there's another wave coming, which will be much more painful than the current wave. Sarah can probably attest to this from the 121 world, which is that the level of retirements and attrition is way ahead of whatever pain COVID is doing right now. And we haven't even seen the lights turn back on yet. So when they are, I think instructors that are true freelancers are going to be able to write their own ticket. And they should not, and that should be a way to have confidence in doing what excites you, not necessarily pursuing something that's safe and reliable and maybe a little less sexy.
A lot of people ask me how I got into ferry flying, and particularly how I got into international ferry flying. Part of the secret behind all of it was the fact that I was a flight instructor. A lot of times an owner buys an airplane who lives overseas, they live in Europe or Central America, and they want somebody to go along with them on the flight who can teach them how to fly internationally and how to conduct that operation. A lot of times some of these people are planning these extravagant flights around the world, or maybe they just want to continue to go back and forth to Europe, even in their small airplane. And being a flight instructor has opened so many doors, and the ability for me to instruct and mentor and teach somebody else exactly how to do this safely. If it wasn't for being a CFI, I wouldn't be where I am now, and I wouldn't have nearly the amount of opportunities that I've had with international flying.
And with that, thank you guys for joining me today. I think that this is a topic that we could probably talk for the next 2 hours about, because it is such a interesting and sort of complicated topic. It's got a lot of risk, it sounds like, but it also has a lot of reward to it. And just to kind of put a bow on all of this, it sounds like the best way to get into it is to find someone who's already doing it and sort of job shadow or be mentored by that individual. Is there a place where somebody could find a list of people who do this so that if they were interested, they could contact someone?
Well, Adam's creating it right now. He's building a CFI mentor where CFIs can go and show up and list their qualifications and what they've been doing. A lot of times on the social media forums, you can tell who's who and who's done what. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes they're quiet and you barely notice them, and it turns out they have thousands of hours of doing something really remarkable. But oftentimes when you search around, you'll see who's doing what. And as we keep making friends and meeting other instructors, the network grows.
Randall, Adam, and Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. I very much appreciate. I know you guys are very busy. And once again, Randall, congratulations on finishing your ATP CTV.
Thanks.